Great, so welcome to everyone who's both here in the room and online. So everyone who's here and far, and everyone who's here now, and everyone who will watch this in the future. These presentations of the Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities webinar series are being recorded and streamed online. So we welcome everyone and thank you for attending. Just by way of introduction, my name is Franco Montalto, and I'm here at Drexel University and one of the PIs on the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, which is one of the main funders or sponsors of this webinar series, along with the other partners you see on the screen. Want to mention, just make a pitch for the fact that Drexel recently became the hub of the North American hub of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, and so fairly soon you'll see some additional some changes to the logos on here. But just for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this series focuses on greening and the use of green spaces, both new green spaces and remnant green spaces and engineered green spaces and natural green spaces for achieving some of the goals that we have for our city. So we're focusing on green infrastructure as an adaptation strategy, defined broadly, right? And it's a 13-part series, and we've broken it up by different sort of problematic areas associated with climate change, from temperature change to coasts to floods, precipitation, etc. And you can see here the sort of breakdown. So again, we have 1 to 3 speakers per month. What we usually do is we allow the speakers to speak, and then at the end we break into a discussion, and that includes the folks who are attending online. You can submit questions in the bottom box of the YouTube stream, and we'll incorporate those questions into the discussion. So this week, and this is my last slide, the focus is coastal and landscape management. So sort of what are we thinking about how we should better manage coasts and landscapes better, given what we know about the challenges we're facing. And so we have 2 speakers plus myself if there's time at the end. So Bram Gunther is director of the Urban Field Station from New York City Parks, and also the co-founder and senior advisor of the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City, and Dr. Christina Roseanne, who is here in Philly at Temple, Department of Geography and Urban Studies, and myself here at Drexel. So we'll start with Dr. Roseanne, give a first presentation, and then if you want to take 1 or 2 questions afterwards, we can, but then we'll go into Bram's presentation, and then if there's time, I'll make a few comments at the end, and we'll use that to leverage discussion. Okay? So with that, I welcome Dr. Roseanne. Okay.
Great. Thanks a lot. To everyone who's here and online. Today I'll be talking about an equity index that I've been working on with a co-author. Her name is Megan Heckert, and she's at Westchester University. And we are looking at developing an index that will help us better target green infrastructure and to think about this idea of equity more broadly, and also to think about kind of future research, thinking more about how to use some of the green infrastructure to address climate change. So just to start off, this is part of research that I'm doing as a part of the EPA STAR research. And the research is not formally reviewed by the EPA, although they give us funding. So the views expressed are mine, so I just want to make that clear. The project team is Art McGarrity's at Swarthmore College, Megan Heckert, Benjamin Hobbs, he's at Johns Hopkins, Claire Welty is at UMBC. We have a number of grad students. Shandor Slay is at AKRF, and then these are grad students, Feng Wei, Hung, and Elvis, and Dina. All right, so the talk I want to give today is I want to kind of briefly, I'm sure you've all talked about it, but green city, clean waters, talk to you about some of the benefits of green infrastructure. Then I want to talk to you about our EPA STAR research grant and kind of the broad objectives, and then the work that I'm doing with Megan on this green infrastructure equity index. And then I also want to think about how we can translate some of this work into thinking about climate change resilience. So in Philadelphia, I think it's important to step back from, here we are in Philadelphia, we have this really innovative plan, but how did we get here? Well, first of all, usually you have to acknowledge you have a problem. We have a combined sewage overflow problem. We were not meeting the Clean Water Act requirements with the gray infrastructure, and we fundamentally couldn't afford to address the problem with gray infrastructure. We also had some really innovative thinkers in Philadelphia. So thinking historically from Ann Spirn, who was at Penn, now she's at MIT, but thinking about designing with nature. So the history, Ian McHarg had written a famous book, Design with Nature. And Philadelphia also had the history of actually doing green infrastructure, so Fairmount Park. So this is, in many ways, it's not surprising that green infrastructure innovation has happened in Philadelphia. And then I put here climate change adaptation, and one of the things I'll argue is that this is kind of just more recently coming into play in Philadelphia. I think we're recognizing that this plan that we sort of already put into place has potentially all these climate change benefits. So we're starting to think more strategically about how to use green infrastructure to address some of the climate needs. For those of you who don't know about what happens in a combined sewage overflow system, is basically when we get a larger rain event, the sewage water and the sewage water from your house and also the storm water runs together, and in order to kind of not back up at the sewage treatment plant, we have to we have these outfalls, and we have to let untreated sewage into the rivers, which is also these rivers are also where we drink, although we drink upstream. But this is an example. This is in February, and actually this was not really a bad day. But you can check this out. It's actually sort of fun to check out. This is called Philly CSO Cast, and you can check out after a rain event. And often you'll see the kind of red, the red exclamation points. They're sort of all over the place after a big rain event. And that is something that we're trying to address with green infrastructure. So basically the big question is, how can we capture the rainwater, hold it during these big rain events and even somewhat smaller rain events, and keep it from, hold it long enough so that it doesn't hit the whole system all at once and doesn't end up overflowing the system going into the rivers. Okay, so this is the vision. I really love this picture. I think this is from the water department, but it really encapsulates kind of a vision for the city of Philadelphia. I think the thing that's exciting about this picture is that when you look at it, it looks so obvious. Of course you'd want to live in a place like this. And for me, I'm an urban planner. I think the challenge is, how do you get here? And that's one of the things that I'm interested in. I would love to see this compared to an existing picture, and probably maybe I should do that next time. But this takes a lot of work to get here. It requires multiple players. And one of the things I'm arguing in the research that I've been doing is that we're dealing with a distributed urban environmental system. It's really different from managing a centralized system, and it requires many of the players to transform themselves and think about partnerships and switch their missions. And it requires kind of new professional training also. I think it's really important for universities to be thinking about how engineers can also be consensus builders and planners. In 2012, the EPA approved Philadelphia Waters. I'm sort of getting used to the fact that they just changed their name, but now it used to be Philadelphia Water Department, now it's Philadelphia Water. The 2012, they approved this new stormwater approach using green infrastructure, and the plan is to convert all of these green infrastructure greened acres, so converting 9,000 impervious acres into greened acres, and to capture and hold this rainwater. It's a decentralized strategy. Numerous cities, agencies, and community partners and citizens are all going to have to be involved. So if you check out the city's Office of Watersheds, you can see the way that they're really innovating, trying to figure out how to get all these stakeholders engaged. So Philadelphia Water is going to invest their own money, then they're also going to leverage private investment over the course of 25 years. So this is an estimate from 2009, but they also anticipated really triple bottom line analysis and arguing that there are many benefits in addition to kind of meeting the Clean Water Act. We could also get economic benefits that would come from green infrastructure, other environmental benefits, and all these social benefits. And one of the things that my team has been working on for the STAR grant is trying to quantify some of these social and economic benefits. So just to kind of run through, many of you probably know this, but there's research showing us that green infrastructure obviously addresses stormwater runoff. It reduces stormwater runoff. It reduces the heat island effect, which is something really important also for climate change impacts. It improves air and water quality. And then for economic benefits, it increases property values and sales near greening. You'll see increased sales costs. It also helps us reuse vacant properties and potentially gives us many green jobs. So planting and also maintaining the green infrastructure, which is going to require a large workforce. So some of the social benefits that have been talked about is people who live near green infrastructure have improved health, reduced stress, reduced crime, promotion of social interaction. It provides amenities, and really part of the theory behind green infrastructure that's kind of counteracting the broken windows effect. So, these are places people care about. So, particularly in a place like Philadelphia, with more than 40,000 vacant lots, is one of the statistics that's often talked about. The idea that someone's caring about a place, that it's green, and that it's sort of put into productive use. It's not abandoned anymore. So just to give you a sense, green infrastructure comes in many different forms. And one of the things that our team is really interested in is each form provides a different type of community, economic, and environmental benefit. So on you'll see the basketball court. So the basketball court is pervious pavement. So it's actually capturing rainwater, but it's also providing a community amenity, right? So the urban farm is also now it's a pervious area. But it's also growing food. It's providing potentially jobs for the community, and also a place for people to gather, maybe an after-school program. So these are some of these additional sort of ancillary benefits that come with green infrastructure. And here's a park. Kids might be playing, then people might be relaxing. So it's providing social benefit. And here's another example of pervious pavement around a tree. So it's not actually providing. Kids aren't playing there, right? Or it's not, but it is capturing the rainwater. And here is it's really a rain garden and one of the challenges, even in this picture you'll see, is in some neighborhoods that it ends up with trash, and there's some often community pushback on some of these green infrastructure projects. So that's one thing we need to be kind of cognizant about is, not all green infrastructure projects are easily accepted. We need to help communities understand the benefits that are coming from them, and also to think about maintenance, right? So this site might be fine as long as it's being maintained. Okay, so I just want to give it a sense of some of the community benefits. So in Philadelphia, the water department has been partnering with elementary schools and high schools just all across the city. And here's an example of this is actually really close to here, but this is the Greeningly project. It was really a community organizing the school, the water department, and they went from the top picture, which was totally impervious, and then to the bottom picture where suddenly all these community benefits are provided in addition to capturing rainwater. And this picture actually doesn't do a great job of showing you, but on the side there's gardens, and so there's a lot of green infrastructure work being done in this picture. Here's another example of where a site formerly vacant is transformed, and it provides community place for gathering. maybe some skateboarding, so different people might think about using the space differently, and ultimately it's capturing rainwater and all the environmental benefits that we talked about earlier. Here's another example, and this is actually what makes it really hard to study green infrastructure, is because green infrastructure is often multiple practices being put in place at the same time. So even in this one site, you might have a wetland, rainwater harvest, what is this called? They're harvesting it in the tank from the roof. You might have this pond or basin. But one of the things that makes it really hard for researchers is to unpack, how is green infrastructure working in different places and different practices working in different places. And this is one of the things that we've been talking about in our research team. So some of the challenges that we've observed and other scholars have as well of this distributed system is it's based on partnerships, which I mentioned earlier, and many communities do not have the same capacity to put green infrastructure into their community. So if you're a city agency and you're requiring that to do your work, you need to have a partnership. One of the problems is many of the receiving communities may not have the community capacity to put green infrastructure in. And so one of the arguments that I'm making in this research along with Megan Hecker is that maybe we need to kind of take a step back and think about which communities really, really need us to make this investment. And then once we identify where we need to be making that investment, we also need to identify what is community capacity, underlying community capacity, and also which types of green infrastructure are going to work in these communities. Because the other thing that we're really interested in is the idea of preference. Not all communities are going to want the same exact green infrastructure, but how can we be more thoughtful about that and develop planning processes that allow different communities to kind of have some community ownership about what they'd like to see in their community. I think the other thing that is challenging, and we see this in Philadelphia, is increasingly greening is being associated with green gentrification. So practices that are bringing community benefits, right? So raised property values are starting to be scary for people who see raised property values as potentially pushing them out in the future. So this might mean in the future we need to do more collaborative planning where the water department might think about addressing affordable housing. So if you're going to put green infrastructure in, maybe you need to build a partnership with the city to promote affordable housing. So these are some of the issues that we see in distributed systems. We also are really interested in this idea of deciding how to use money in green infrastructure sites. So I could spend $100,000 on a tree trench or a playground, but who makes this decision? Is that something that happens at the water department level, or are there ways that community groups can get together, do a charrette, have a discussion about how to use the money in a more effective way that brings them the outcomes that they want? But this really means unpacking what are the benefits of green infrastructure. And it also means recognizing, again, this idea of community capacity. Not all communities are going to have the capacity to bring a charrette together. So what can we do to improve that? Okay, so as a part of the larger project that Megan and I are involved in, our team is developing what's called a decision support model. And we have brought together some stakeholders from Philadelphia who have become a part of our research team. We're calling them the Green Philly Community Advisory Research Board. And so we have members of CDCs, we have people from the city, the water department, the Forest Service, different community groups, watershed organizations who have met with us and talked with us about how we can basically, they've helped inform our research. So we're trying to understand how to value green infrastructure and what the community priorities are for investment, and really to develop a tool that other people could use. And then Megan and I have really been focusing on this last question of how do we use green infrastructure to promote equity in planning. So this is a model that we've been developing, and I don't know if I can actually, can I get, I'm not sure I can move around here to, but, well, anyway, so basically, I'll just talk it out for you quickly. So this is the Stormwise model, and this is just a mock-up. But the idea here would be, and this is ultimately the goal of this project, is that you could select, well, I really want to reduce my runoff, sediment's important to me, nitrogen's important to me, and phosphorus. And then, based on the kind of underlying data that we've collected, you can push this button, the pink button, minimize investment costs, and up will pop up information for you about which type of green infrastructure is going to be the most effective for you based on what you said was important to you. And here I want to switch to the next slide, where we've been partnering with the Village of Arts and Humanities to think about, well, at a community level, maybe there's some other benefits that are coming from green infrastructure. So perhaps aesthetics are really important to you, or a community amenity is really important to you, so you'd love to have a playground. And maybe job creation is really important to you. So these are some of the other variables that we want to be able to put back into this larger model to prioritize which types of investments go where. So if you only have a fixed amount of money, what does your community want? What are the benefits? How do we maximize these benefits? So this is the larger idea of the Stormwise model. And then I want to talk to you quickly about what Megan and I have been working on with this Green Infrastructure Equity Index. So as I mentioned, there are community benefits that come from green infrastructure, and we have a distributed approach. And here's a map, and this is actually probably a little bit out of date just to give the water department, or sorry, Philadelphia Water more credit. But what you see from this map is that it is distributed across the city, right? So in many ways that is good news. But we were sort of asked this other question, so kind of take a step back, and this is, what is actually nice about getting to be an academic. What would an equitable distribution of green infrastructure look like? And here we make an argument, which is that if you give something to everybody, that's actually not equity, right? Because here in this case, you gave everybody a box, but the little guy can't see. And we're making an argument that actually we need to rethink, we need to step back. Some people don't need a box because they can see the game already. Some people only need one box, and some people might need two. And this is the idea of thinking about need, right? So our argument is that equity is not equality, and currently many of the projects are distributed around the city, but we want to think more strategically about developing this equity index, or really a deprivation index, right? Who really, really needs green infrastructure? So what if it were about need, is the big question we're asking, and how do you measure need? So our argument is that need is socio-economic conditions and also the built environment. And so this is kind of, I'm just going to briefly go through how we built this index, and not with all the variables. So we're looking at socioeconomic indicators and also built environment indicators. And this is a lot like EJ screen. The idea of indices is I think, really exciting to see the way that we're able to use GIS and just to kind of bring together and target areas that we want to do investment in. So first we're looking at park access, and we built a buffer zone, tree canopy, and playground access, buffer zone, and then where are the vacant lots, and we're normalizing these indicators. Actually, let me just go back quickly and show one other thing. For the built environment, we also have things like ozone levels, particulate matter, tree canopy, playground access, impervious pavement, amount of vacant land, and proximity to traffic. And for the socioeconomic variables, we have percent minority, low income, low education, percent under 5, over 64, and percent owner occupancy. So we're really trying to look at some issues of vulnerability in the index. So here we are. looking kind of where there are a lot of vacant lots, in part because that's an opportunity for green infrastructure. We normalize the indicators, and then in the end we develop a green infrastructure equity index. And what you'll see here is that the areas that are very dark black are the areas of the most need, according to this index. Now, you could change this index, and one of the things that we are arguing for is that we're trying to get this index so maybe you could put scales on it, so you could take it to community meeting and people could choose, well, I don't think that's a great variable, I'd like to change that. So really this is just a kind of a test model to see, play around with this. And then we wanted to see how does this compare to if we just had a single indicator. And what we see is that it is more refined. If you just look at percent minority, it doesn't tell you very much about where to put green infrastructure. If you look at percent low income, also, it's not telling you as much. What we found is when you combine many of these indicators together, we're able to kind of narrow down. So we go from thinking about, where would we need to do green infrastructure? If we only look at the top percent minority, we're looking at only 64 block groups. If we look at low income, it's 122 block groups. And if we look at both of them together, or if we look at the index, then we find 33 places, block groups that kind of we've identified as having the most need. So we also wanted to see if there are locations that have these equity voids where they actually don't have green infrastructure installations. And I should note that this is research that we did a few years ago, so some of these might have changed, but just to give you a sense. What you see here is that the area that is black are areas where there's the highest identified need, but zero green infrastructure, right? So the idea is that this would help you target green infrastructure. And one of the things we'd like to do is to actually ground truth this, right? Go out and, already you can see that there's some, the waterfront. Some of the data is a little skewed. So we're not interested in, we need to figure out a way to get some of this data out of here. But we do want to see areas that are identified as really having need and not having access to green infrastructure. We're really cognizant of the idea that not everybody defines need in the way that we've done it. And they're not going to place the same value on every variable. But we do think that there's a real benefit to using this approach because it changes the conversation about equity. It provides a visual tool that communities can use, and it serves as a flexible framework for weighing priorities. And so what about climate change? In 2014, the Philadelphia Water developed this climate change adaptation program, and they're predicting more rain, extreme storms, higher air temperatures, and rising sea levels. So it's looking like we're not going to get out of this situation. So some of the climate change impacts are potentially 2-foot sea level rise by 2015. These are actually data that I took from the climate towards it's a Climate Ready Philadelphia. So one of the things the water department's concerned about is the 2-foot sea level rise potentially means that 200 of these outfalls are vulnerable to submersion. The movement of the salt line means that much of the infrastructure that's in place could corrode a lot faster. They're talking about flooding, heat islands, increased risk to vulnerable populations. Many of these are health risks, and increased cost of health problems. So they thought it's an extra $20 million a year by 2050. And then they estimate that just one very large hurricane could cost about $2 billion in the city of Philadelphia. So here's the map that I have in this new report that came out in 2015, showing some of the inundation that would come from different categories of storms. But I think where I see the work that Megan and I have been doing, really mapping pretty much directly onto the climate change story, is to think about, they've done an index also looking at sensitive populations, and this is in 2050. And what you find here is that the flooding is really not the issue. The issue is heat island impacts. So I think for green infrastructure, we need to think about, dealing with, really we need to get involved now in planning for the heat islands of the future. And here's another, this shows you the surface temperature, so really predicting the heat island again. And then I just wanted to map that back onto the work that Megan and I have been doing, and to show you that it's pretty close, right? So Megan and I have been thinking about, we want to see with this index, we could easily add in other variables, thinking more about future heat island impacts. And so I think there's a lot of play that we can, that these indices can give us. I think it requires kind of bringing it down to the ground. So one of the things that we're doing is we're partnering with the Overbrook Environmental Education Center. We're trying to work with them on kind of testing this. And what we really want to do is kind of have people eventually play around with the model and see if it's transferable. So the other thing that we have been trying to figure out is how to connect this Green Infrastructure Equity Index back to the Stormwise Model. We still think there's a lot of research to be done in the best practices in GI in different neighborhoods, and how green infrastructure can really address the equity void. We also think that getting climate change in there is a really important thing. So I want to thank you for inviting me to this lecture and also pushing my thinking on that. So thank you. And here's if you have questions.
So maybe if there's a quick question while we switch up presentations, otherwise we'll do the discussion at the end, but if there's a quick question.
How does your Stormwise model work?
How does it work? I think it's not really like a one sentence. To be honest, if you want to know how it really works, I need to get Art in here, who's running the model. So it has multiple variables. So we've been able to figure out, each different green infrastructure practice, how much each one costs per square foot, how much each one captures rainwater per foot, how much each one pulls in nitrogen, how much each one does phosphorus, and then, so all the kind of, for each green infrastructure practice that you see on the list, there's a set of kind of costs and outcomes. And then what we're trying to also add in with the group of the Green Philly Research Board is each green infrastructure practice also has these community benefits. So could we map them back on? So if you say, it's really important to me to reduce phosphorus, but I also want green jobs, you can push the pink button and out pops, this is how much, if you want to kind of optimize your investment, this is where you should put it. Does that make sense? But if you want to know the backstory of how it works, you got to go to Art. So.
How much variability do you see in the cost for different Bmps based on their site? Like a rain garden in one spot might cost more than another spot. So
yeah, so that's actually some work that we're doing with Shandor, because that's a great question, but I don't have the answer on the cost. But that's something we're building into the model, and we also have a hydrologist who's working with us to figure out, what the effectiveness in different areas across the city would be. So, yeah.
Do you have a sense of spatially where are there any specific places where most of the Green City Clean Water expenditures have actually gone in the city, and do they match your mapping of needs for green infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the big map, they're kind of so I would argue no.
Okay.
And that's actually one of the things that I think, I was actually kind of heartened to see that I went to a talk about the city's sustainability office. I noticed they're developing an equity index, but I think if you start to think about needs, then it's different from saying, we have some money, who wants to work with us, right? And I mean, to be fair to the Philadelphia Water Department, they do a lot of outreach, right? But in terms of kind of getting these practices in place, it takes time, and it also takes community capital that not all communities will have. And I think that's one thing we're trying to highlight with this research.
And you don't have a measure for community capacity index, right?
No, and
So-
actually, Lynn Mandarano, it has been working on a different measure of that. So, but yeah, that's something that we also could put in there to figure out. So it's actually hard to figure out, what does it mean? Even just measuring what is community capacity is a question. But so you could maybe look at like how many CDCs do you have or something. But that's a factor that you could also put in. So for us, this is really a preliminary kind of first step. And thinking about kind of how to bring it back into the larger model is something that we're also trying to figure out. So.
Okay, thanks, Tina. So our next speaker is Bram Gunther, who is a friend and a long-term research collaborator with Drexel. We've worked together for many years on various aspects of green infrastructure planning, and so he's going to talk to us about some of his recent work on resilience.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. First thing I want to say is that I am actually the co-director of the Urban Field Station. The Urban Field Station is run with our close partners, the U.S. Forest Service. And so my co-director is Erica Svensson from the U.S. Forest Service. So I start, hold on. I also represent, so obviously I represent the New York City Parks Department, and I've been working for the Parks Department for 25 years at this point. But I also represent the Natural Areas Conservancy, which is a nonprofit that I co-founded about 4.5 years ago that works with the city of New York to increase their capacity to do world-class or high-level restoration and conservation work focused on our natural areas. And I'll come back to the role of the Natural Areas Conservancy and some of the stuff that we do. And I should say, just to make distinct about what you've talked about when I'm talking about land management now, right? From the municipal context primarily, but how do you manage the land in a big city? What are your goals? What are your perspectives? I'm not going to talk so much about politics, they'll be inherent. So this is the perspective that I'm bringing. But I'd like to start here. And I want to start here not only because I absolutely love this rendering. It is not a picture. It is what Manhattan looked like in 1609. And not only can you see the hawk, and you can see the smoke of the local tribes. That is the Henry Hudson's ship. Does anyone remember the name? Sailing up the Hudson River in 1609? The Half Moon. So this is good not only to understand your own history, which is important for lots of reasons, of course, but to understand where we came from when you're thinking about ecological restoration, or you're thinking of the creation of nature, which is what we spend a lot of time talking about. And the last thing I wanted to say, it's good to remind ourselves that our cities are superimposed upon nature, and not the other way around, which many people sort of said, we tend to forget that. No matter where you are in the world, the cities are superimposed on this. So this is what we have now. And you can see that New York City is just under 60% built. And by that, I mean all the things that you would think of in terms of built. Nearly 30% landscaped, and that includes things like street trees and ornamental gardens and so forth. And then of that, 11% is natural areas, forests and wetlands and grasslands. This just gives you a sense of the layout of the city. And I like this quote because I think it's important to remind ourselves, those of us who are in the nature business, and I am in the nature business, and I'm in the urban nature business, that there is no tract of land that is too small for the wilderness idea. Okay, so who are we? I need to give you some context to who we are before I can sort of start talking about some of our current programs and some of the next steps, or at least the way we imagine them. So the division that I represent within the New York City Parks Department is forestry, horticulture, and natural resources. It's interesting to know that many years ago, forestry, horticulture, and natural resources were their own divisions, and we have now merged into a kind of nature division for the Parks Department to manage these resources together, which makes a lot of sense, and you'll see how I sort of weave this theme of, collaboration, of multifunctionality, of, redundancy into the way we function, not only function as a division, but the way that we're defined and the way that we're structured. I didn't read the mission statement because I'm assuming you can do that. So you can see that we start with all our programs are overlapping. Sometimes we do it really well, sometimes we don't do it so well. But in the fact that they overlap and in the fact that we are one division, you have intersecting and what I call reinforcing programs and partners, which breeds resilience, right? So I would argue that you need some level of internal resilience to be able to practice resilience in your capital improvements and the way that you maintain and conserve sites in your relationships with the communities. So it's a simplistic slide, but you see the point that I'm making. So in many ways, the beginning of this, let me rephrase that. When I started with the division, I started with the Parks Department in 1991. I was an urban park ranger, and very quickly, this is one of the jokes of my existence, is that I really learned about nature in the Bronx. I was stationed as a ranger in Van Cortlandt Park, which is in the Bronx, and it was the first time in my urban life. I grew up in New York City on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, so it was the first time in my life that I was actually in nature every single day, 8 hours a day, in this case 7 days a week, because I live near Van Cortlandt Park. So not only did I get to see the sort of the incremental changes in nature on a daily basis, what I really got to see is how the community interrelated with their parkland, what was meaningful, what was not meaningful. This was back in the 90s, things have changed. And then as a ranger, I had to develop programs that spoke to that. But when I then switched divisions and joined forestry, horticulture, and natural resources, it was first initially forestry, and our focus was exclusively on street trees, which are the trees in which you get the biggest investment from the city because of the trees that people directly relate with, and it's the most risk management that you have to practice. So some of the things that up there that these pictures are representing is pruning regimes, increasing the size of our street pits. Even 20 years ago, our pits, 10 years ago even, our standard pit was 3x3, 4x4. You can see the change, taking down the dead trees, the risky trees, pruning them with citizen pruners as their formal term, using trees and green streets and other land types like that, and a program called Trees and Sidewalks, in which we saved some of the bigger trees whose roots were upheaving the sidewalk. And previously you would just cut the roots and that would spell the death of the tree, but now you can build design around them. And in many ways, the modern forestry or modern forestry program comes from our street tree censuses. And we've just completed our third one in 3 decades. The first one in 1995, 1996, they take 2 years. It really ushered in the era of pruning rotations for our trees, which of course you need to have. In 2006, we were able, through iTree, Dave Nowak and iTree, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, we were able to quantify the value of our tree, and that's the little diagram to the bottom left. That was something that came out of us being able to give the data to the iTree and the researchers. So we had an understanding of the economic value, which then led directly to the Million Trees program. So once we had the ecosystem services and we were asked our opinion on long-term sustainability and resilience, we said, well, this is what the tree provides, and we have the data. And we got one thing first. I'm going a little fast now because I want to spend more time on the last slides. Is we got an understanding through not only the census, but our capacity to map things, like Christina was talking about, where there was equity where there was inequity. And we came up with a program called Trees for Public Health, which was partly based on Department of Health data, where there was high incident rates of childhood respiratory doctor visits and low canopy. So we focused on those neighborhoods first. Since then, that data connecting the two is not as certain and as clear as we thought it was back then, but it's still good to be planting in neighborhoods where they have no canopy, for the reasons of the ecosystem services on the last slide. So these two pictures give you a sense of what a block that was inequitable in our mind looked like, and one that became a bit more equitable as it relates to trees. And then it also, as I said, led to million trees. And that was because we had the data to say this is the economic value of these trees, and that led to a lot of money. And you need a lot of money to do the kind of things that both you were talking about, Christina, and what I'm talking about here in terms of land management and transforming neighborhoods. And so these are some of the statistics from it. And by the way, that was the first tree that we put in the ground. Okay, so just a little bit about horticulture. Like forestry, horticulture in many ways is the oldest of urban natural resource practices. Gardens and trees, individualized trees, have been part of cities from the very beginning. Horticulture is one of our initial practices in civilization, and that figures into what we do. There is a division between what we focus on, which is essentially best practices and mapping and analytics, and how the boroughs take care of these gardens day to day. But these are some of the things that we're focused on through the lens of horticulture. Growing plants, looking at our relationship with pesticides, inventorying our 4,000 plus gardens, maintaining them, and doing continuing education. So then we get to wetlands and forest restoration. And in 1984, the Natural Resources Group was founded, the oldest municipally funded public conservation group in the nation. And in many, in very distinct ways, Natural Resources Group, which is now part of the big division that I've described, came from the fact that we had a commissioner then who asked what all these undeveloped parkland was. And that's the way these areas are more than 10,000 acres of forest and wetlands and grasslands were referred then. And at some point we would get there if we had the money, and we'd build hiking trails and recreation centers and so forth. But because of that question, we started to understand through an analysis of what was there, both in diversity from our past and also invasive species and litter and debris. And that led to a focus on our natural areas that when there was an oil spill in the Arthur Kill, which divides New York City and New Jersey, we were able to come together and say we need mitigation for that. You can't just give money to a general fund. You have to give money to restore the natural areas that you just degraded. It also then led to some state bond acts, which really jump-started our wetlands program. And in terms of forests, we had an early grant in the 90s, which was about reforesting. Now we know we have over 7,500 acres of forest, which led to million trees. If you remember the previous slide, we put half of the million trees in our forested areas, which also led to, in this evolution of focus on these areas, ultimately to the Natural Areas Conservancy, which I described before, which, like conservancies across New York City, come into existence to increase the city's capacity to do a specific thing. And in this case, it's to manage and restore our natural areas. In fact, I refer to us as the Central Park Conservancy for Forests and Wetlands. Okay, a little bit of background on green infrastructure. In 1997, an initial Green Streets program began, and that was to create gardens in the right-of-way where they didn't exist, and it became our biggest community beautification program in a long time. And over time, and particularly when I met Franco in 2006, we started experimenting. I realized that we had this Green Street program with a lot of capital money, and why shouldn't we be experimenting with capturing stormwater? I was going to do it in a kind of land management capital improvement way, just building trenches to get the water in, but I didn't have the capacity to measure it, and that's when Franco and I have met, and we, as Franco said, we have stayed both very close colleagues and friends since then. A few years after that, the New York City Green Infrastructure came out, same kind of reasons that Christina was describing. There was a consent decree. You've gone through the details of why. Our harbor did not meet Clean Water Act standards. We had to come up with some strategy, and so 10% of the water in our priority sewer sheds are going to be addressed through green infrastructure. Once that came out, we teamed up with the Department of Environmental Protection on this, and we are now moving into parkland, which I'll get into a little bit more in a later slide. And then we're all preparing for what is MS4, which is 60% of the city is combined sewer overflow, and probably just under 30% are these single sewer systems, and we need to clean that up too. And then the urban field station, really what I want to say here is in 2007, the relationship started. In 2010, we got a building in Fort Totten, and it's really about where science and land management meet. And I think we all know or all believe that our land management, our quality of land management is directly increased by the relationships we have with people who are doing research and our understanding of the data, and then our understanding of capacity to use that data to impact how we do land management. And I'll get more into that later, but I want you just to focus on the picture to the left. That's our Nashville site in Queens, and which Franco is one of the first sites that Franco was able to put in his instrumentation that has given us incredibly valuable data over the years and helped us in a feedback loop with our designs. I show this slide more because I wanted to show you the importance of analytics in our division, being able to look at things spatially, being able to look at things this way to make decisions. And I think this speaks for itself in terms of stewardship, but it's a very, very critical part of what we do and how we make decisions. So this brings us to the next part. Franco and I have been reading similar literature, and we both have read this author named Ahern, and so I've taken his basic ideas and filtered them through my own experience and my own language and my own aspirations, and I call it aspirations towards sustainability, and that word aspiration I underscore because a lot of it falls into that category. But there's multifunctionality, and I say this because our programs are going to be stronger and better if they have these components. Multifunctionality, redundancy, diversity, and I only put in red, that's the only political statement I will make. Diversity, resilience, and strength come from variety, not the other way around. Connectivity, flexible management, most people say adaptive management, but I find most people understand flexible management better. Collaborative conservation, which has been around for a long time, but now we're practicing it in the cities. Community decision making, how best to do this, and I'll come back to some examples. And let's not forget beauty, peace, and inspiration. That sounds like an Elvis Costello song, doesn't it? I didn't mean it to. All right, some current programs. Okay, I come back just very quickly to say this ability to quantify ecosystem services continues to be really, really important for us, and our capacity to convince decision makers, particularly those who have some power over money, to give us money for the programs that we want to happen. And they have advanced significantly since the initial iTree work and the U4 work. So we understand things in a more complex way. We also have access to LiDAR. And Sabatino and the crowd asked me before, where are we on our new iTree report? And we are having it redone for a bunch of reasons, but next year we should have both a new LiDAR and a new iTree report, which will give us a very complex view of vegetation change over time and also the economic value of the nature we have in New York City. I just wanted to show you that I'm not going to forget maintenance and risk management. We spent a lot of time doing this. It is not as sexy to talk about, and people don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but we have a lot of trees. Our new street tree census revealed that we have 666,134 trees. That's a lot of street trees. And they need to be maintained, otherwise you don't get the ecosystem benefits from them. And they also need to be managed through risk for, I think, obvious reasons. Branches and trees, when they can experience lots of things that make them fall or drop branches on human beings and on property. And so this gives you a sense of just the scale of what we have to do. And I should say that we are on a 7-year pruning rotation now for all those trees, which meets industry standards. So one of the really important things that came from Million Trees is that once we had the money for the program, it was announced, we were like, all right, where are we going to get all these trees? We ultimately ended up planting just under 200,000 street trees, 500,000 trees in our forested areas. And our traditional way of getting trees when we needed them is we'd go out with a contractor, we'd find what was available on the market. Sometimes it was something good, sometimes it was the dregs of the market. And we realized that for a program of this scale, we needed to have more control over that market. So we developed 9-year-long relationships with local nurseries that not only increased the quality of the trees that we were going to get because they had to follow our specs and procedures for growing it. We got increased diversity, which was a big boon for us. We have a 2-year replacement guarantee from these nurseries and the contractors. And it also, for the forest trees, it fed in native plants into the system, which is very important for resilience. And speaking of plant conservation, we have a native plant center in Staten Island, a 14-acre site in which we collect native seeds to grow plants for ecological conservation. And you can see how that directly speaks to diversity, connectivity, all the things that we were talking about, and that'll come feature in again. And so the bottom left is the collection of seeds, and then the top left and the bottom right are pictures of the nursery. Okay, so here's a bit where data meets land management. The first initial big project of the Natural Areas Conservancy was to do an ecological assessment of all our 10,000 acres of natural areas. That took 2 years. Using that data, we were able to develop a matrix like this in which we could understand each spot of a park within that matrix between forest health and forest threat. And you could see how we could use that to make decisions. If we have a limited budget, we have to decide where that goes. It could be along the lines of equity. It could be along the lines of ecological health. It could be along the lines of the threat that particular place is experiencing. But really what we have also, in addition to that, what we've been able to do is take that data and sit down with people in the Parks Department, so there's the dovetailing between the two, and really look out over the long horizon, a 20-year horizon, and start developing a forest management plan for the city that takes into costs of restoration, both divided by contractor and in-house crews, costs of maintenance, which is the maintenance sort of soon in this establishment period where things are most vulnerable, and then long-term conservation, which you can see has direct bearing on how we're going to structure our land management programs. Here's another example. So we recently, as I guess a year and a half ago, we produced the Alley Creek Watershed Management Plan, and you can see how we started to take a multifunctional approach, a redundant approach, looking at diversity, looking at connectivity, using adaptive management, the feedback that we get from researchers all the time, to put together a plan that looks at this whole watershed, that comes up with all these different types of recommendations for habitat restoration, green infrastructure, but more importantly, how they work together, because the sum is greater than the individual parts, and also how they link up with a neighborhood's or existing capacity to do stewardship work, or their lack of capacity, and therefore we need to nurture those groups, or even maybe there is no groups, nurture new groups into being so they can work with us on long-term sustainability. The Natural Areas Conservancy produced last year what's called the Restoration Opportunities Inventory. It's a look at all parks-owned wetlands that totals 450 acres. These are sites that have not been restored, so 450 acres of salt marsh restoration. You can see how we broke things down, but you can sort it in many different ways. So ultimately, it is a tool for planners, whether they're in the division or city in general, city planning. How can you integrate wetlands restoration into long-term city plan, into coastal revitalization, wetlands revitalization, by looking at these types of variables? And you can see how I list them. Some of the most important part is where can you directly work with stewards? Where do you have to get contractors? And I want to say that this work helped us leverage $10 million for coastal restoration in sites in the Jamaica Bay watershed after Sandy. So we're also working with our partners at the Forest Service on understanding community, understanding of their own nature, their reaction to it, what they expect from it, what they want from it. We called it the social assessment. The social assessment is focused on communities' relationships with natural areas. This does not take into account street trees or bioswales or rain gardens or green roofs. It's just a focus on natural areas. But as you can see, it's representative of us trying to understand what the community wants. Some of that work, some of our understanding has led directly to our mapping of trails in natural areas, and then trying to work to create trails that are more formalized, safer through that formalization, are marked better so people can see them, and then by closing up the desire line. So if you look at the top slide and the bottom one, you see how we're going to close up all these pathways, and we're going to restore forests. And in this case, we're going to restore maritime forests. This is in Marine Park in southern Brooklyn, and Marine Park is one of only 2 parks in New York City that have remaining maritime forests. And then community engagement, which I don't think I need to explain in this slide. So next steps and opportunities. So considering multifunctionality, redundancy, diversity, connectivity, adaptive or flexible management, collaborative conservation, community decision-making, how do you structure your programs going forward? One, of course, here's the collaborative stuff. You got to work together. It really doesn't work well to work in a silo. So not only do we list some of our public partners here, the Parks Department just wrote that. You need some kind of template. You have to start from some place. Salt marsh protection, here's some of the adaptive management, the flexible management. We got grants specifically from the EPA in this case to assess the conditions of some of our largest marshes citywide. Our collaborator on this is also the Nature Conservancy. We evaluated vulnerability to sea level rise through rapid ecological assessment, through sea level affecting marshes model. We can talk about the model later. I can't speak about it so well anyway. Conditions and vulnerability indices. What's more important is then identifying and prioritizing restoration and protection opportunities, including acquiring or transfer of land to address marsh migration, removing hard surfaces that impede marsh migration, increase elevation of current marsh surface, rebuild marsh edge to extent lost to erosion. So this is manifested. So you not only taking that information that I just described and remembering that Alley Creek Watershed Plan, we're going to have an opportunity to do a similar type of thing in northern Staten Island. We'll have other opportunities in other parts of the city, but you can see we're trying to mix all the recommendations together so the sum is greater than the individual parks, and bring in what the community expects and would like to see there, as well as what we need to do to manage stormwater and some of the impacts of city life. Here's another kind of blank slate in a way. You might have heard about it. I'm not going to get into the story too much, but after Sandy, there was actually one neighborhood in New York City that opted for the state buyout. 450 homes, I don't remember the exact number, are now gone. People have left the neighborhood. And so you have this kind of blank slate. What do you do there, right? And people are thinking about that now, but rarely in a city like New York City do you have a blank slate. Now, when the community turned over this land to the state and the city, they said, in a covenant that they wrote, very much, I guess covenant's not the right word, but I forgot what they wrote, maybe a testimony or manifesto. They said, an underscore, we want this to go back to nature. We do not want it developed. The whole story of why they left is really intriguing, and we don't have time to get into it. But the point is that here is a place to really experiment with what our resilient future looks like. So speaking of the same types of things, I mentioned the Native Plant Center before. The Native Plant Center also functions as part of this national program called Seeds of Success, which is broken up by regions. It's a Bureau of Land Management program, and it's to put away the seed, or not put away, to collect the seed of native plants in regions. Some put away for a kind of Noah's Ark syndrome, but mainly to use those seeds to grow plants, to revegetate areas of the country that have been degraded or destroyed for some reason. This all came out of the West and all the fires that they experienced. They realized, my God, there's no supply chain for this. So we are the Mid-Atlantic seed bank for the Seeds of Success. However, there is billions of dollars in restoration money through Sandy, through FEMA money, through HUD money, and there's not enough plants for those restorations over time. So we're spending some time thinking about how do you jumpstart the supply chain. And since we're doing it on a very small scale now, we need to jumpstart it quickly because obviously plants are not ready just when you're ready to put them in the ground. You need a lot of lead time. Sorry, I keep smacking that thing. Okay, so another thing that we're working on is climate-adapted urban forests. I had previously talked about the work that the Natural Areas Conservancy did to assess our forests, to understand how to use that data for decision-making. So one of the things that manifested from it is this long-term forest management planning, but specifically in this case, how to use our data and the data of the New York State Natural Heritage Program to analysis to understand changes in forest succession and how we should manage for that, for both resilience and climate change, develop climate-adapted planting palettes. What does that look like? Is it the same as it is now? Can these plants adapt, or is it a different type of mixture? And then we would like this to serve as a kind of national model. We do not have models or standards for urban forests in this country, and we're hoping that this can help create it. As I mentioned before, our green infrastructure program is moving into parkland to help the city capture the amount of stormwater that we need to reach the consent decree thresholds. So when we know we need to move in, here's very much a multifunctionality question. How can you build to manage stormwater, because that's what the money is coming from, but giving all this other multifunctionality to the community, including ecological diversity. As Christina mentioned before, we're also starting to understand how important heat is based upon the data. If you're looking at through the dangers of climate change, this is more dangerous than our storms. So what we're trying to understand now is where the vulnerability lies in the city and how we can use, since our program directly deals with trees, our currency is trees, how can we use trees to mitigate the vulnerability of neighborhoods across the city. So don't forget communication. As a land management, a municipal land management division, we cannot forget, particularly now, how to communicate. 25 years ago when I started, in all honesty, our communication was less important. We kind of, in many ways, did what we wanted to do. But that doesn't work anymore because our goal is long-term sustainability. And if you're not first letting people understand the ramifications, and then two, hearing what they expect, it will go off course. So this shows you, these slides are the Natural Areas Conservancy's communication campaign, but I use it to speak for anyone who's doing this work. Another thing that the Natural Areas Conservancy started in 2015, we have an advisory board. So with advisory board and friends, we had a year-long series of workshops to come up with what we call nature goals. And so two primary things happened. One, with this group of people, we came up with 5 priority functions that we want nature to serve over the horizon from now to 2050. And those are the priority functions there. They also include priority components like access to nature, engagement with communities via nature, having nature integrated into citywide planning. But we also came up with a Declaration of Rights to New York City Nature. And that's the first per paragraph. And so, yes, we're being high-minded and a little bit, what's the right word for it? Romantic, maybe? I don't know. With this statement. But the purpose really is, as we move into Nature Goals Phase 2, is to use that declaration for coalition building through grassroots merging of community stewards, of land management, for local land trust management and conservation groups, to use, again, using the sum is greater than the individual parts, to having these people come together, sitting at the same table, and then using the declaration as a mechanism for advocacy, for investment in nature over time. So phase 2 now of Nature Goals as we see it, and we hope we can get funded, is increasing the amount of people at the table, to local community groups, to environmental justice groups, to local conservations and stewards, and bringing them into this conversation so we can come up with very specific targets citywide, so we can use that to help decision makers to say, look, I need to fund that, it's very clear. So as I'm finishing up, I want to point out 2 particular initiatives that sort of speak to community-driven green infrastructure, which Franco and I have been talking about, which includes all those things that I've been mentioning along the way. And so how does it organically come from the neighborhood? So they both, interestingly enough, and we want to sort of move past this model, but this is a good way to talk about it, both these examples come through mitigation funds. So there was a blackout in Western Queens, and for over a week, people did not have any electricity, and so food was thrown away. People's lives were very disrupted, and nowadays, there is channels to ask for, environmental restitution or mitigation money. They did, and you can see from this map how people were coming together to talk about what the neighborhood wanted in terms of nature in their neighborhood with that money. And this is the kind of structure that was built, right, which is interesting as a way to think about how to do it now. The money was put into the North Star Foundation as a kind of bank. It's more complex than that. It wasn't just at a bank account, but it was in many ways. You can see the different partners. You can see how they were intermingled with community representatives, and they came up with a long-range plan for what they wanted, and I can get into the specifics in this next example. So this example follows the same kind of model as Greening Western Queens. This is in Greenpoint. 13 to 30 million gallons of oil were spilled in the Greenpoint over the last century. The New York State Attorney General sued Exxon, and they ultimately won $19.5 million settlement. The monies were put into a community fund that addressed Greenpoint's top environmental priorities. Greening Greenpoint is selected as one of the, that one you get. And so here is what the community came up with. And in many ways, the Parks Department is just a mechanism for this, right? A very important mechanism. Increase tree canopy cover planting by 500 new street trees and park trees. Promote healthy, long-lived trees. There speaks to sustainability. Add 1 acre of new green space overall to Greenpoint. Treat all the gallons of stormwater. eliminate, you see, local air pollution. Train and educate community members to inspire a lasting network of tree stewards. And before I end, I want to say that, excuse me, that I had been, in speaking of communication, I've been spending a lot of time looking at surveys and studies on how to communicate about nature best. And there's a series of Nature Conservancy surveys on what works and what doesn't work. Surprisingly, or at least to me, people hate the word resilient. I don't use it anymore, except in esoteric crowds like you. They don't like the phrase green infrastructure at all. That I understand intuitively. But what most resonates, first and foremost, what resonates is clean water. And in many ways, we've been talking about the whole time. What also really resonates is community preparedness, long-term community sustainability, so the next generations have open, safe, clean places to recreate and have family activities. And so more and more and more, I'm using that language to talk about all the things that Christina was talking about, that I'm talking about, that the entire division, the entire agency of the Parks Department, and all our partners are thinking about. How do you make this stuff last? It's got to be meaningful. If it's not meaningful to the people in community, it won't last. But I do want to end on this, right? And that is, in all of this, coming back to that rendering of New York City in 1609, don't forget the beauty component to it. If you do, it won't be as good, it won't be as sustainable. Don't forget that sometimes you need a break, and nature is the best place to take a break. And if you remember from the nature goals slide, one of our priority functions voted on by all these people in the room was inspiration, that if nature, local nature, whether it's a street tree or a forest, is not working to give you inspiration, it is not working. How do you come up with targets for inspiration? I'm not exactly sure. And one of our newest programs is an artists in residence program that we just started this year. And it's a way to bring in different perspectives to open up alternate ways of land management in our park, but also alternate ways to talk about management, and also to help these particular artists to think about how to represent urban nature. And I thank you very much. That's all. I don't know, do we have some time for you?
Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions, and I'll get the next.
Okay.
Question. Or Ziwen, are there questions online?
No.
Go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, this was so interesting.
Thank you.
I have one quick question on air pollution. Do you take into account how trees are having an impact based on the concentration of other pollutants in the place where they're located in the iTree program, or is that something that is continuing to evolve as you'll develop that?
It's both, right? The iTree report will give us a sense of an individual tree's capacity to filter pollution, and we can extrapolate that out citywide. I'm not an expert in this, and I'm not a scientist, but what I don't think we can do is say that if you have a chain of street trees in a certain neighborhood, can you rely on sort of a long-term decrease in pollution, and how would that affect individual residents, right? And I think that's going to be over time. But yes, we have a good sense of that, and that is always part of our arguments for why we need more money for planting trees and for maintaining them over the long haul.
That's great. My second question, I grew up in the South, in the woods, and so it was very foreign to me when I moved here recently to hear an urban resident say, I chose not to take a job because it was located in a facility beside woods.
Beside woods.
My family told me that is not safe and it's scary and you shouldn't take a job there. And so I'm curious how that plays out in New York City. Is it a challenging communication issue to actually encourage people to access nature?
That's a pretty interesting question. That's obviously not my experience with nature in the city, and I don't see that expressed a lot. What I do experience is two things. One, that with people who aren't able to get out of the city a lot or not able to go to parkland like where we have forests and wetlands, there's a certain amount of shock factor when they find themselves walking into the nature and there's bugs and all the things that make up nature. But I think it's a positive shock value. The other thing I can say, of course, is that in our attempts to create better access and better trails, some of that is about safety. I don't think it's about somebody who works adjacent to the building, or at least that's not how we're experiencing the discussion. It's more about having somebody feel safe going onto that trail, which takes you away from the right-of-way, which is where the people are crowded together, and into a more lonely place, and making people feel like, okay, you know what, there's not anybody here, but I still feel safe. So I have not experienced that directly. And in fact, it's been the opposite. We have experienced through the lens of real estate that, of course, people, that individual houses and even businesses increase in value the closer they are to parkland. And if you look in the New York Times real estate section, they're constantly lying about how close they are to parkland, just so they could put it in their tagline, right next to Fort Greene Park. And then if you really look, they're like 5 blocks away. But so that's the way I've experienced it. Okay, so let's segue into Franco and his ideas.
Actually, there's a question online. So people are asking, you get people to invest their volunteer time, their votes on taxes, and their commitment to upkeep by showing them what's in it for them, and especially for their children and seniors.
Can you read that one more time? Sorry.
People are asking, you get people to invest their volunteer time, their votes on taxes, and their commitment to upkeep by showing them what is in it for them, and especially for children and seniors.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement. And I would say that, you know, what our programs now, and particularly going into the future, are fundamentally based upon that communication feedback loop.
And actually, people are also asking if you can include some examples of publication for any kind of, you know, the material that you include in your presentation this seminar.
Sure. I think some of the most accessible stuff is Plan YC from the previous administration, which has now evolved into the current administration to One NYC, that lays out a lot of these ideas. And I think that's a good place to start. Even in the iterations of the Green Infrastructure Plan, they talk about that. There's work from my colleagues at the field station, Erica Svensson and Lindsay Campbell, that talk about the social aspect of what we do. And the bibliographies in those documents will lead you to lots of other places that can sort of reveal this current thinking. Okay?
So just because of the timing and the fact that it was sort of relevant given the topic, I sort of added myself to the end of the lineup today to talk about community-based green infrastructure. And these, in part, it was because of a segue and a setup that Bram said he was going to give me at the end of his presentation. But then, having heard Christina's presentation, it fits really nicely, I think, into the setup that she gave all of us in terms of talking about sort of equity and other community goals that we might be trying to accomplish with greening. So I am a professor here at Drexel, but I wear another hat as a consulting company, Design Dynamics in New York, and I have here some of my colleagues because the projects that I'm going to talk about are projects that I've been involved in more on the consulting side and less on the research side. So I just want to acknowledge my co-authors who are from the Trust for Public Land, eDesign Dynamics, and Boomi Environmental. But I want to sort of like put this all into this larger context. If we were sitting here 10 years ago, around the time when Bram and I first started talking about these topics, there was an evolution or a piece of the evolution that was happening then, which was trying to make the case for a decentralized way of accomplishing our goals, right? So there was this big discussion, and I remember being in front of large groups of people talking about dollars, talking about scenarios that involved, putting a green roof on every single roof in a city and saying how much water would be managed. And it was this whole big discussion about, can we get the benefits that we know we can get from a centralized approach, or we think we can get from a centralized approach that's very, very costly. And at the time, it was discussions about multi-billion, $10 billion investments just to reduce sewer overflow. Can we get those benefits more cost effectively using a decentralized approach, which is what we've been talking about, all of these little green initiatives that we've been talking about adding to cities. And because cities needed to do this quickly in order to meet the regulatory timeframes associated with consent decrees, there was this push to standardize our effort. We're going to pop out, millions of bioswales, hundreds of tree trenches, lots and lots of green streets, and we're going to design them according to certain standards. And what I wanted to do is just sort of reflect a little bit on where we've come in the last 10 years. What we found out is that now that we actually won that argument, right? We have billion-dollar green infrastructure plans around the country right now. We meaning those who are pushing for the green approach. But when you get down to actually trying to implement it, what we found is that the green infrastructure is actually harder to insert into our cities than we thought it was. And we have issues associated with geology, issues associated with subsurface infrastructure, problems associated with land tenure, management, maintenance, all kinds of issues that have, in some instances, really reduced how far we could get with the standardized green approach. And so there's now, I think the next step in the evolution is the one that we're talking about now, which is how do we do the decentralized infrastructure at scale, given what we know about all of these obstacles that are actually out there, and obstacles that maybe we weren't talking about when we were first trying to push this approach a while ago. And so, I've sort of come to the conclusion that there are two directions that we need to pursue if we want to overcome those obstacles and get to the scale benefits. And one is bringing together multiple stakeholders. And the second is sort of being opportunistic in terms of multifunctionality, making sure that in these ideas, which we're now plopping down into individual neighborhoods, there's something in it for everyone. So, this next step here is, I think, going from green to what I'll call resilient, right? So we're still focusing on decentralization, but instead of a standardized approach, we're now trying to sort of customize what we're doing, as we heard in Christina's presentation and also in Bram's presentation. We're trying to customize how we're managing water, for example, in different parts of the city to meet the needs and goals of those different parts of the city. And at the same time, in doing that, we have to now be effective at doing multiple things, right? So if the public right-of-way sites that are available to managing stormwater, for example, streets and sidewalks and schoolyards, if we've exhausted all of those and we still haven't managed enough stormwater to improve water quality, we now need to look at more difficult to implement or difficult to plan sites like backyards, spaces that are used for recreation. And we need to allow those uses of those sites to continue as we start to do things like manage water. And I'm going to call that the sort of transition in this evolution from green to resilient. And as Bram mentioned, there's some interesting literature out here about how do you do this, how do you build resilience, how do you insert community goals and multifunctionality into what you're doing. And I'll just sort of review these quickly. This multifunctionality, in the context that we've been using this term, it's in maximizing the number of different services that you're trying to get out of a given piece of land. So you can't just have a park that is a recreational space or a roof that covers your building. You need to sort of figure out how those spaces can provide multiple sets of services. And then by doing that in a sort of spatially disaggregated way, we're addressing redundancy and diversity, right? So if you have lots of little things that are collectively adding up to the benefits of one big thing, which is sort of intrinsic to this decentralized approach, one can fail and you can still have success at the larger level. So there's built-in redundancy, but there's also a necessity for diversity, because all of the spaces within our cities are in different conditions, and they're different biological conditions, but also different social and urban conditions. So these two features go hand in hand. And then, because what we're trying to actually accomplish is a benefit at scale, we need to be able to transcend from small scale, local, to large scale, regional. So there are sort of connections that need to happen across space, but then across time. The regulatory timeframes from our green infrastructure plans are, for example, 30 years in the future. So along these 30 years that we're actually trying to achieve water quality goals, our cities are renewing, our buildings are falling down and being built again, we're putting in new infrastructure. And so there's connectivity across time and also across domains as we try to link together various urban desires with the need to manage water. And then finally, as Bram called it flexible, I'm calling it adaptive, but we need to build learning cycles and co-learning cycles into what we're doing so that communities are learning as government is getting involved in implementing projects in their neighborhood, but government is learning as community expresses various ways that they'd like to see that infrastructure built. So why do we need community-based GI? I've showed this in the last seminar series, and I love this slide because it's sort of, these three squares are equivalent land areas. One is Hoover Dam, and the right is Philadelphia. So you think about sort of how many decisions need to be made to impact how water flows through each of those squares. And I'm not underestimating how many decisions went, or how the gravity of the decisions that went into building Hoover Dam, but maybe there were tens, maybe 100, but tens of decisions that needed to be made to sort of change how water flows through that area. And then you could think of sort of irrigated agriculture, where you've got lots of farmers operating in a plot of land in Nevada, maybe hundreds. But a city like Philadelphia, of course, there's tens of thousands of decisions that would theoretically need to be synchronized in order to sort of have some level of control over how this piece of land manages water, for example, as one of the services that we're talking about. So for that reason, I'd like to sort of put out there that urban watersheds are socio-ecological systems, and this is a term that's not new, it's not something, it's been around since the 90s, complex integrated systems in which humans are part of nature. So, to think about roofs and, roofs as part of the natural system, which is something that, we heard really interestingly about what's going on in New York, but also, of course, in other cities like Philadelphia. So then the next question becomes, how do we best work in socio-ecological systems? And I want to sort of draw from some of the literature that's not actually about green infrastructure, it's not about climate change, it's not even necessarily about the United States, but Bill Easterly, who's a professor at NYU, wrote a book in 2006 called The White Man's Burden, which is really about the failure of international development projects. Why is it that we invest lots of money in certain places and don't always get the outcomes that we expect, and makes this distinction between sort of like what I'll call the big plan approach, which is not unique to planners, engineers are planners as well, and contrast it with this searching approach. So I just want to talk a little bit about that because I think this, although it's from a different context, informs very much what I think we're all struggling to do with respect to greening the city. The big plan approach is not unique to planners, but it starts with a vision. It starts with, I'm trying to accomplish, you could think of all the modernist ideas of the 50s, all these ideas about what we're trying to do to this place. And then, local conditions are there in the background, but the idea is really, we're gonna change this place. So it's almost like a case in point. Each site becomes an opportunity to manifest this larger plan, not necessarily emerging from those local conditions. So ultimately what we have is sort of a tweaked, but not that different version of what the planner came in to think about in this site. And that's a very different approach to the searching approach that starts with the fact that every site is diverse. There comes this term diversity again. Every site is potentially very different, and there are different sets of needs that we might need to address in each one of these sites. And so for that reason, we need to approach these problems from different frames of reference, and we need to be aware of the fact that we need to always go into these types of situations thinking, are we talking about nature goals? Are we talking about equity? Are we talking about water management? Are we talking about recreation? All of these things are on the minds of various stakeholders who are potentially interested in these spaces. And so if we do that effectively, what we come up with is through negotiation, we come up with a sort of integrated or multifunctional solution that is unique and customized and calibrated to what is actually needed in that particular place. And I call that the searching approach. And we can search in different ways. And this is some old research that we did in South Philadelphia. I'm not going to talk about all this, but we were searching for community experiences that were sort of potentially should be addressed by the city as it starts to think about how it greens cities, issues associated with gentrification, for example, but also the sort of history of relations between urban communities and the government, which, as we know, has not always been constructive. We can talk about searching for cost effectiveness, and this sort of harkens back to the Stormwise model, but this is another model that our group here at Drexel has developed, which allows you to, in the context of a community meeting, sort of rapidly go through various kinds of green infrastructure scenarios in an effort to find those solutions that get you where you need to be, but that are at the lowest cost. So we could think about it that way. But the one that I want to focus on here is how do we come up with green infrastructure site and design strategies that address multiple sets of goals? And I think this is kind of the theme of this entire session of the series. And so to do that, I want to talk about a project that I, through my consulting company, Design Dynamics, got to collaborate with Boomi Environmental and the Trust for Public Land with funding from the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And this project was really looking at green infrastructure opportunities in Camden as specifically a way of addressing multiple goals. So we wanted to find places and ways within the city that money that was earmarked for managing water could be used to help the city to achieve other things that it wanted to do. So we came up with, it was interesting before to hear about, I wrote down the term and I don't have it there, this gap kind of idea. We came up with this idea of developing ecosystem service gap scores. So places in the city where a particular service, for example, heat island mitigation, was lacking. And we mapped those. And then what we did is try to design green infrastructure that was unique to those areas that met those service gaps or filled in those gaps. And we started with this idea of ecosystem services, and for those of you who are new to the term, the idea of an ecosystem service is a service or a benefit that we get from an ecosystem. And generally they're categorized in four areas: supporting services, provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. And there have been folks who, for over a decade now, have been mapping these services to different physical attributes of a landscape, but then also various metrics of well-being. But our question to start here was which ecosystem services did the communities that we were interested in, did they need? And can those services potentially, through creative designs and creative siting ideas, be provided by green infrastructure? So I'll mention that Camden is a city with multiple challenges. It's depopulation, various environmental justice issues, high levels of poverty, crime, drugs. And we were working on this project with the Camden Smart Initiative, which is sort of a coalition of various community stakeholders who are addressing a lot of these challenges in a variety of different ways. So we started sort of with interactions with the Camden Smart Initiative through the Trust for Public Land. And then I don't have really time to go into the details, but what we came up with were a series of 8 services that seemed to be the most important in Camden. Food provisioning, water regulation, climate regulation, flood regulation, education and cultural services, recreational and cultural services, and spiritual cultural services. And then what we did was mapped each of these services to specific things that were happening on the ground. And so, for example, I'll talk about climate regulation to demonstrate. Climate regulation turned into a discussion about heat island reduction. And then heat island reduction can be looked at from the context of various physical attributes of the watershed. For example, tree cover, impervious cover, population density, which would tell you an idea of vulnerability, right? So you could have an area with very low canopy, lots of impervious cover, but nobody lives there. Or you could have very low tree canopy, lots of impervious cover, and a lot of people living there. So we put together metrics like this using GIS, and then in the polygons here, which are actually drainage basins, so this is the entire city of Camden, and to make the outcomes of this study of interest to the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority, which is responsible for managing water and addressing flooding issues, we did the analysis at the sub-basin scale and came out with a score. And so the score, the color of the score tells you something in terms of the gap. So, for example, here are now all of the services color-coded by sub-basin. And the darker red areas are, and it's a normalized score, so it's on a rank from 0 to 1. So you're able to identify which parts of the city have the greatest needs for example, heat island reduction, flooding reduction, stress reduction, et cetera. And like Christina's presentation, we wanted to really, we're interested in still developing a tool where, in the context of a community meeting, folks could adjust how much they care about each of these service gaps and then sort of superimpose in different ways these scores to come up with sort of an aggregate measure of ecosystem service gaps. This one was just assuming that each of those services are uniformly weighted. And then what it comes up is some interesting ideas where you've got parts of the city where ideally you would want green infrastructure to, of course, manage water, but also provide food and target and address flooding. Or another part of the city where there's a real need for jobs and capacity building. So you'd want to have highly interactive green infrastructure. Or places that are lacking in terms of fitness opportunity. So there you would want to have recreational green infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And we then, what we actually did with this project was went into those neighborhoods. So we picked 4 pilot neighborhoods. We went into those neighborhoods, and then Trust for Public Land has a very elaborate set of park development criteria that they use that allows you to go in and look at community impact, the volume of stormwater, the potential, how feasible is it for doing these improvements? Are we sort of addressing some of the crime and other issues that the city is facing? And come up with sort of a ranking. And I won't really get into this, but it's a metric that allowed us to identify 4 conceptual sites, and I'll show just 2 of them. Here's one. This was a park, and if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you see the ecosystem service scores. So the top 3 ecosystem service gaps for this neighborhood was food provisioning, in other words, urban agriculture, stress reduction, and heat island reduction. So the goal here would be to figure out a way to manage water while also showing some progress on those issues. And so here's the site, and here was the concept that we developed, which involved, I'm not going to get into all the details, but involved using orchards and street-side fruit trees and other recreational spaces arranged with rain gardens and stormwater bump outs as a way of sort of interacting with the community. And what we did was actually developed not just a sort of physical concept for the park, but also this kind of larger, you could think of it as an operations plan that shows how, for example, if the community members are involved in park operations, they're actually involved in providing fruits, vegetables, and gardening spaces, and they're in so doing and involving the community in the operation of this park, you're granting them access to new spaces, and the process, the work that they're doing is increasing canopy coverage. At the same time, the products that they're producing, can be brought to market, providing a revenue source in this park, which is now also, of interest to the regulatory agency as a stormwater management facility. And so, we developed some very coarse numbers that show, for example, in this one, $12,000 in annual food sales revenue for an investment of $6,000 in O&M costs associated with sort of pruning, spraying, and harvesting food in this park. We know, of course, there's many constraints to be able to do this kind of a thing. But we wanted to sort of, in the spirit of sort of aspirational, to give this kind of an overview. And here's another one. This is a sequence of vacant lots. The top 3 services here were job creation, heat island mitigation, and CSO reduction. And the concept for this site was a nursery, given that Camden is adjacent to Philadelphia. Philadelphia's got $1 billion green infrastructure plan. As we heard from Bram, there's always this problem about where do you get the plants. So the concept was to convert this vacant lot into a nursery that creates jobs, but also manages water. And then to do it kind of almost in a distributed way, where you've got these sort of distributed networks throughout the neighborhood to sort of invite people to this. And you know, the basic operation or business plan for this park was even more interesting. Based on what green infrastructure plants are going for in Philadelphia, you could make potentially in that space $150,000 in annual plug sales for $25,000 in O&M costs if you do this through sort of an interactive, sort of community-based plan. And you know, I'm not going to get into all the details here, but it's very similar. It involves including the community in the operation of the site as a nursery. So, I mean, I just want to sort of say this last piece, which is that, you know, these are conceptual, but how would we actually take these things to final design? What we would do is not unlike what the Trust for Public Land is doing in Philadelphia and in New York through their Parks for People program, where, you know, you take a playground like this, you go meet with the kids who use that playground, and then you come up with a design like this. So participatory design is sort of required. It's a requirement for I think how you take this customized approach. If we're not willing to be participatory, we're then sort of falling into that planner model. And you know, we've done this in other places, and these are just some interactive projects in New Jersey where we figured out how to make green infrastructure sites educational, promote exercise, manage stormwater. And so I think, you know, the point here is that the last phase in this evolution was that from gray to green, we know that gray is expensive and only provides one service, and we know that green is potentially more cost effective, but we're only going to get there at scale if we can figure out how to do this widely. I'm personally, as someone who's been working in green infrastructure for a long time, not interested anymore in these sort of flagship projects that look great but cannot be replicated. What I want to see is opportunities for how do we do this really in a revolutionary way, where we're really changing the functionality and the relationship that we have with our urban space and with the nature that's in it. And so I think that means what we're really trying to do is develop this resilient infrastructure strategy that connects multiple needs, and this is sort of needs us to be participatory and adaptive. And you know, I'll end with, I know that this isn't easy, but I think, and you know, back to being in the sort of educational environment here at the university, I think what to me it says is that we as designers, planners, engineers, architects, et cetera, need to get better at negotiation and consensus building skills. And we need to sort of figure out how the ideas that we have, which may seem really great on paper, how do they become meaningful to the folks whose lives we really want to impact, you know, as we face things like climate change, but also a whole host of other challenges that we're facing in cities. So that's, not sure, I thought that was the last slide, but that's it. So I will take a question if there's any time, or we can go to a general conversation.
There's a question for Christina.
Okay, Christina.
Well, someone asked how to balance millions of dollars in GI projects, leveraging billions in redevelopment funding, overwhelming GI goals, increasing gentrification, short of mandating percent of low-income housing. Should I repeat?
Yeah.
Maybe you can come in just because there's
Just read it. Sometimes. Sorry, what's this say? Okay. Yeah.
Can you
so
just
the
come?
question is how to balance millions.
Christina, could you come in because the microphone is here.
Okay, I'm stealing your computer.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the question is how to balance millions of dollars for GI projects, leveraging billions in redevelopment funding, overwhelming GI goals, increasing gentrification, short of mandating a percent of low-income housing. And I think my answer to that is I think, I mean, I've been working in Philadelphia and on green infrastructure and urban agriculture and working with other city agencies. And I think one of the challenges that we have is we still work in different silos. So the water department they're breaking a lot of boundaries, but at the same time, they are, I think we do need to have a kind of more holistic view of planning and to think about the actual impact of green infrastructure. So if we know that green infrastructure investment ultimately leads to gentrification, I think we should be bringing the affordable housing people to the table and bringing community development organizations to the table just as a responsible way of planning. So I think it's kind of, I don't have a percentage of affordable housing that I think we should be doing. I think it's a more systematic approach to planning that's kind of bringing all these things together. Hopefully I answered your question.
Just to add to that, I need to go up to the
Yeah,
mic.
come to the mic.
It's a brief statement, but just to add to it, we were, I forgot where I was, but Majora Carter, that's a woman that probably many people have heard of. She started Sustainable South Bronx, but she was talking and she said, she and nobody in her neighborhood have any problem with green gentrification in their neighborhood. They just want to be the recipients of it. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, that it's not always just about displacement. What it really should be about, which is what you were saying, and I think the question was getting at, and what Franco's whole example in Camden is about, is how can you gentrify an existing neighborhood with the people who live there currently, and how does that work, and what does that work look like, instead of what has happened over time is displacement, which doesn't work on many, it works for a smaller slice of our complex and diverse cities and country. So that would be my response.
It just doesn't strike me as possible, unless you have examples, that greening would cause gentrification and not the other way around. Like that greening would actually be the thing leading to an increase in property value and increased residential demand and all the things you associate with gentrification. It seems to me that it would be very hard for me. I can think of many very, very green, lush areas in Philadelphia that are also many, many low-income areas. And I can't think of any areas where there was low income and there was greening that somehow then caused that neighborhood to become. It doesn't seem like a...
There's some good research on green like if you Google green gentrification, you'll see some people have been doing research on that idea. And I think the question is, I think some communities feel targeted, particularly communities that are sort of on the cusp of being gentrified, and then suddenly, for instance, in Philadelphia, if the water department suddenly says, we're doing this, we want to invest in this neighborhood, and they're kind of at the edge, they're already feeling the pressure. Sorry.
So it's the mic that's actually doing
Oh, this is mine.
It's actually that.
So my answer to that question was that definitely check out, just look at some of the good research on green gentrification that talks about some of that sort of chicken and egg problem.
Is there any evidence, though, that actually greening in a low-income neighborhood, because areas on the cusp are already areas that are gentrifying, so that is it. It just...
I think if you, if you just gentrify a place, if you put just green a place that doesn't have any of these pressures, it doesn't automatically mean people will come, right? But if people start to see, if you start to see green infrastructure as an amenity, and then there's already pressure for people looking for new places to live, and particularly if you're the next neighborhood on like a gentrifying trajectory, there's a reason to be that these residents might be worried about it, right? So particularly if they're looking at, this neighborhood, they got all this investment, and then the story, which is what Bram was talking about, they got the investment, ultimately property values went up, people were pushed out, versus if we could think more strategically about, low-income home ownership programs or something that might be tied with development of green infrastructure, or working more collaboratively with community development groups to kind of merge those issues. But you know, I think that research is actually getting pretty good, so I would definitely, you know, I would definitely check out where you know, it's not like you can just plant a tree and it'll gentrify, but it's more complicated than that, so, but I think there is some good research, so.
But on that point, I mean, I will admit, I mean, when I moved to New York City to Philadelphia and tried to figure out where to live, so I'm a gentrifier. I picked a tree-lined block that was more attractive to me than a non-tree-lined tree, you know, and so, I mean, it is sort of the chicken or egg question, like, was it a tree-lined block which made me want to live there? So you know, blame, you know, or you know, did I move there and you know, more greening attention came? I think it's more like, of course, gentrification is driven by housing markets and regional dynamics and all kinds of other things, but it could be that as an asset that people value, along with other things, like it could also be, I mean, I think, you know, an improved school could be a gentrifying element of a neighborhood where people say, oh, that's a good school, I'm going to move there. But certainly to the extent that greening is viewed as aesthetically pleasing and is linked to recreational opportunities and other things, to the extent that that's one more amenity that a neighborhood has, then those who in our society have the ability to decide to live there will go live there and change it for the people who maybe were living there because there was nowhere else to live, or nowhere else that they could live. So I believe it's one of many factors. I don't think I can, you know, point to, oh, I mean, except for Central Park, you know, which of course changed the property values of everything around it to the highest on the planet. I mean, I don't think that it's a common occurrence that a few trees or a couple of tree pits or a park displace people by itself. But I think in the larger dynamic of urban change, you know, it's one of many factors that results in dynamics that could be destructive if we don't think about a priori how the people that live there now are protected. I mean, that's just, that's my perspective on it, as a gentrifier.
Can I ask what, so in New York and in Philadelphia, you have relatively different structures in terms of the relationship between like the city government and the neighborhoods. I don't think in Philadelphia there's any equivalent of community boards like you have in New York, really. I think the members of the city council districts have very different powers in those cities. So what do you think would be like an ideal structure in terms of trying to organize voluntary activities that would be a decentralized greening effort in terms of what ideally would be, you know, the organizational connection between local groups, what kind of local groups would be ideal to have for a greening effort, like the civic associations, or would you go through like, I don't know what, like, and how would they connect, or what kind of authority would they have, or kind of checks would they have against, you know, central government decisions, or what relationship would they have with the district council office, or so on?
I can start.
Yeah.
So one of the ideas that is floating around in New York City, but I don't imagine it's exclusive to New York City, but we're discussing it now, is how do you take government money for green infrastructure, which in most cases is for stormwater, not in all cases, but empower a community group through that money, right, which has to be responsibly managed by the city. That group that is trusted within that community, whatever the geographic boundaries are. I'm not saying it's our community boards in New York City. It's more nuanced than that. And that is very written out. It's a clear kind of contract that they have to go through a suite of steps with that money that's been given them to, using the term that all of us have had these community charrettes, where they come up with a menu that matches their particular community, like Franco was talking about. Some communities have high water table or high bedrock, others don't. Sometimes there's more green roofs more roofs that can be converted to green roofs, in other neighborhoods less, and so forth. Those are just quick examples. Create this menu, and then come in with the green infrastructure interventions that both give you the stormwater thresholds that you need, but give you the multifunctionality And then that group continues to get city money and money that they can raise on their own for long-term maintenance and monitoring. The maintenance would be localized with training, and the monitoring in most cases would be in collaboration with professional researchers, whether they're at academic institutions or nonprofits. So that model is sort of emerging, and so does that work or not? I can't tell you, but that's what a lot of people are starting to think about, to give genuine power to a community group and be able to trigger this kind of thing that we're talking about. It might be different in Philadelphia, but I know we're talking along those lines in New York City.
Do you want to answer that? Okay. Yes. So for Philly, I think one potential, because we've been trying to figure out what we were calling zones of green infrastructure. So we've been trying to figure out what's the jurisdictional boundary we should pick. So one thought we've had is thinking maybe about the registered community organizations. Like, could they play a role in this? I think that just the fact that I don't think we want to be creating another layer of, there's the registered community organization, now there's the green infrastructure. So it'd be nice if it kind of rolled with something that's already happening. When I hear Bram talk, I get really excited because it's like, oh, it's participatory budgeting, and thinking. So I think one of the challenges is, you actually have money out there to do something with, right? And so in that sense, maybe there's some more opportunities for the water department or Philadelphia Water to put out, calls for, here's some pools of money, get together, come up with a plan, figure out. And the reason, our Stormwise model, and it's funny to see all of our work because it's really similar, but the Stormwise model is supposed to be a tool that you would be able to be in the community meeting with and then say, wow, it's really cheap. The cheapest option here that gives us what we want is this, let's put in 10 tree trenches and, and then a playground or something like that. So, but anyway, I think that's a great question. I don't think we have the right answer, but that's where we need to go. So,
let me just add one more thing quickly. So there are tools being developed across the country. I'm going to speak about New York City. A tool in New York City called Vision Maker, and it's developed by a colleague named Eric Sanderson. And the tool is supposed to function as a means for an individual, but more importantly as a community, to imagine what they want on this interactive website that produces a report that enables them to say, here it is. We don't know necessarily the insider language. We're not engineers by training. We're not municipal employees like I am in this field. But here's our vision. And 50 people in the neighborhood got together over the last 6 months to put this together. People the age of 9 and people the age of 90. And they're not going to necessarily know how close to reality that is, but it's a place to start. So the fact that we have this tool called Vision Maker and it can be used this way, to me, is really emblematic of how we're trying to find mechanisms to make this happen. And as all three of us have said, it is critical. I don't think we're going to reach sustainability without doing this. I'm willing to say that, not go out on a limb. Maybe I am. But so the fact that so many smart people are thinking about it. However, the hardest part, of course, is do the economics and politics match this? And your guess is as good as mine.
Can I just add one more thing? So for our Stormwise model, one of the challenges we have right now is it's really built by engineers, and it speaks the language of engineering. And I think what Bram was talking about is something that we've been working on, and kind of the next step for that is to think about making it much more visual. So you want to be able to ask a community, hey, do you want to look like this with 10% canopy cover, or do you want to look like this with 50% cover, right? So then click. You want to be 50%, you want to be 80%, right? So visually showing people what the choices look like, and maybe even allowing them to kind of pick sites in their community, put in different green infrastructure so they can visualize it. 'Cause I think that's the thing also, this idea you mentioned before, also people hate the word green infrastructure. when I called people and asked them, and can you be a part of our advisory board? And I talked to them about green infrastructure, they're like, you know. But you know, when I say, well, the water department's doing this, this is investment in your community. You know, there are opportunities for playgrounds or for reinvestment in parks or making it your streets safer. You know, the way that you're talking about it's really livability. Then people understand it. So I feel like that's the other dynamic is like kind of how do we kind of get out of even what we've been talking about here, this sort of engineering, planning, you know, dialogue, and how do we make it so, you know, people who have smartphones and a computer and understand visuals can just click, yes, you like this, click it, click, you know, so.
So we're actually out of time for this room, so.
Let's go.
Just want to thank everyone and see you next month.
The worst of it. Here, see, first for-